So today we're speaking about power and health. You know, last time it was culture and health. And I actually want to start with the article by Ida Sesser because I think it's power is more straightforward in that piece. And then, you know, we'll move on to Foucault, which will complicate things. And to introduce Ida Sesser's article, I mean, it's part of a larger orientation within medical anthropology called critical medical anthropology. I'm curious if any of these terms are familiar to you. Have anybody heard of critical medical anthropology before? Maybe critical theory. That's such a broad term for me. Maybe.
Something that comes under that, maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it does or doesn't. Yeah, maybe. I mean, certainly many things called critical, you know, like critical psychology, they often have things in common, and that they're more aware of power inequalities and things like that. I'm asking that because I'm not sure if some of these concepts are already familiar, but because I'm also, yeah.
I think it has more to do with the aspect of political economy as an aspect rather than dealing only with the folk cultural dimensions of study.
Yeah, okay, that's exactly it. Yeah, it's work that has more focus on the political economy of the situation rather than the cultural, you know, folk ideas, values, the kinds of things that she's pointing out in the first few pages in this article. So I'll just put that term up here. Yeah, so it's a focus on, it's what Ida Sesser's article is. It's an example of it, focusing on the political economy rather than the cultural issues. They're not interested in the different ways of seeing the world. They're not interested in the ontologies of medicine like Stacey Langwick was with, you know, trying to understand African healing. And the rest of medical anthropology, you know, there's other labels. I'm not sure how useful they are. I mean, the medical anthropology that's not critical medical anthropology, for example, the kind of work in maybe Obiasekere, you know, does. It's sometimes called interpretive medical anthropology, sometimes called symbolic, but mostly it goes sort of unnamed, as sort of like there's medical anthropology and then there's this sort of thing. And many people, I think, have over time merged the two things. You know, even if you're doing more interpretive work, you should be aware of the political context in which things are occurring, and I think that's the standard. I even detect that in how you describe your research. Many of you who are doing PhD research, you sort of already have that awareness of the political and the cultural at the same time. In my own work, in the first book I did, Mud Packs and Prozac, it was a study of Ayurvedic and allopathic treatments for mental illness and also religious treatments. I was interested in these different approaches. That's very sort of interpretive medical anthropology. It wasn't focusing on the political economy as much as it was focusing on, well, it wasn't focusing on the political economy really at all. I was interested in, you know, understanding the Ayurvedic approach to mental health, understanding what people got out of going to mosques, temples, and churches. But in my next project, I wanted to do something more like critical medical anthropology, something that had more of a political intervention. And that was my project on patents, India and the patent wars, because I had become aware of, I mentioned, I think on the first day of class, that, you know, there was this global controversy over AIDS drugs, antiretroviral drugs, that were produced at low cost by India, and big pharma companies would, sue to prevent reproduction of their products. I figure I should intervene in that. Maybe I can help, this product, can expose, corporate skullduggery and play a small part in finding, a role for global public health, improving access. And so then I did my research on patents, not just from the side of access to essential medicines at low cost around the world, but also from the biopiracy side. So my second book was kind of trying to follow this model, but I found it very difficult. I mean, what I found in the book, I could not find, simple evil, good versus evil. A much more complicated picture. In fact, I was talking to some of you just before class and explaining when I was finally able, it was very difficult, but when I was finally able to talk to people from pharmaceutical companies, I was trying to speak to the powerful agents, involved in the patent controversies. I couldn't speak to them directly to any corporate section, but I found that I could speak. This is ethnography. I'm just struggling to make contacts and running up against a wall of silence. And finally, I decided to go through the corporate philanthropy side of pharma corporations, because they're willing to talk to the public. And I asked them, how they balance access to their medicines, because they have all kinds of philanthropic programs that are quite interesting. How do they balance that access to their medicines, which they often give out free in low-income countries, with patent rights? And they were willing to speak about that. But the first person, though, I was able to speak to at the philanthropic side of Pfizer Corporation, one of the largest drug company in the world, she turned out to be a medical anthropologist. So I had finally spoken, had a chance to speak to the evil hegemonic other, and it was also a medical anthropologist who spoke to me. So it was complex. And the more I went into the details, well, this is in my book, Mudpacks and Prozac, India and the patent wars, and maybe I can speak more about it later. But what I found was actually a situation not where, global big pharma was ruthlessly making money off the poor. What they had actually done, these big pharma companies, is they just ceded the low-income market to Indian companies. They just, Pfizer, Gilead, these just says that they actually signed licenses, contracts with Indian companies. You guys can have the entire low-income sector of the world, because Indian pharma, not because Indian pharma is generous and enlightened, it's because their production costs are lower, so they're able to offer the product at a lower cost. I met some of the executives of Indian pharmaceutical companies, and they're rich people, extremely rich. They're making lots of money off saving the poor. And they have their own corporate philanthropy programs. And I believe that the global big pharma companies realized that they were not going to be able to make a profit anyway. You can try to sell your drugs to poor people at high prices, but then they're not going to pay what they can't pay. So, but what they did, though, in these licensing agreements, the global big pharma kept the high-income market to themselves. So Indian companies couldn't compete in the high-income market, but they do in the generics market. Most generic medicines sold in the U.S. are made by Indian companies. Indian companies, though, located in the U.S. Like Sun Pharma in Delhi has 17 manufacturing plants in the U.S. Anyway, the more I looked, the more complex it became. It wasn't a simple.
But Professor, like people say this is a dangerous activity, and there are medical e-waste, which is kind of very big threat to the country, particularly India like country, because they are manufacturing a lot of this kind of, though it is low in price cost, but it became an environmental pollution or environmental threat to the Indian citizen. No, like I think that is
Oh.
a very big challenge India is facing because of entertaining such kind of things. No?
Okay, environmental pollution from pharmaceutical?
Exactly, medical waste is a very big disposing of this medical waste.
Oh, I see.
It's a very big question mark.
Oh, sure. Okay, yeah, right. And I'm not even considering the environmental aspects of this whole industry, but that's also part of it, yeah. And what I also found was that was the most important thing, you know, so big pharma companies gave the, you know, seeded the low-income market to India-based companies, and kept the high-income market to themselves, but the middle-income market was crucial. That's middle-income countries in these licensing agreements, like Brazil, China, many parts of Latin America, that are profitable more than low-income countries and less than high-income, but still very profitable and very lucrative. Those were kept by the global big pharma. So they divided up the territory. And so the problem became, I decided, the main thesis of my book, the problem in pharmaceutical access was not so much among the poor countries, even though that's still always an issue. I mean, at least AIDS drugs are very accessible in many poor countries compared to other things, necessities that you can get. But for the poor in middle-income countries, there's a problem of access. For example, Brazil, middle income is what its classification is, so they fall under the contracts of the global big pharma, but there's many poor people in Brazil that cannot afford, so the prices are higher in Brazil, but the poor can't access. But then the Brazilian government created pharmaceutical companies to make AIDS drugs, and sort of challenged the patent issues in court. Meanwhile, activists in India, like the Lawyers Collective in Mumbai, was able to challenge several patents that global big pharma was trying to take out in India to protect their products. They challenged several successfully. And so there are many important products that are not under patent in India because of political and legal opposition. So that's what I found is this very complex picture that was very interesting and had certain, the problems were in certain niches, you know, like the poor in middle income countries that are left out of the system, as it were. So that's, you know, my attempt to do critical medical anthropology for a while. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is it correct to say that critical is equal to anti-establishment to at least?
Maybe anti-establishment if we understand that really only in the political economic side of things. I mean, maybe there's other ways of being anti-establishment in terms of, you know, aesthetic, you know, values and other things like that, but in sort of a very kind of class and income-oriented way. I would say that's the case. And there's, you know, Marxist influence in a lot of these perspectives. Yeah.
So if I may ask you a advice, so when you talked about talking to big pharma representatives, how do you navigate that? So some of us, I think,
Yeah.
we have to talk to the corporate side also a lot.
Oh, okay. Yes.
When you get an interview with them, how do you start off? Like, because I mean, in my case at least, I do want to hold them accountable or question them, but how do you start off without offending them? But I'm very distressed by the idea of going to corporate and interviewing them and trying to get their side of the story at least. But could you give some insight on that?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, that's in fact that's also what I was just talking about in the hall before class with some of you. It's very difficult, first of all, to get to interview people like that. I mean, they generally don't want to talk to the public. They don't want to talk to researchers. They've managed their corporate structure so that they are able to engage in a monologue through their PR offices. And if you look, actually, when I tried to interview Pfizer about their view of global patent struggles, the largest pharmaceutical companies, their headquarters are in New York City, like 15-minute walk from my office. And I tried to, if you look online to try to contact them, there's one phone number. You can't find any other phone numbers. You can't find a specific phone number for a person in a department. And so everything goes through one set of operators, and they can, I remember I tried that, I'm not going to go into all the details, but it's a long, complicated story. I tried that number, got passed on to some person, left a voicemail, heard nothing back. There's a contact form online where you can submit a question. I tried that, no response. I tried, they did have a media relations department, so I tried going through that, and I got a response saying, oh, well, you're not media, you're a researcher, only media inquiries. But then they said, you might want to contact our corporate philanthropy side. I'm like, oh, that's like a good idea. I hadn't thought of that myself. And that was the key. They invest a significant amount of money in corporate philanthropy. I mean, maybe it's just good PR, maybe some of it's genuine interest in making their products accessible, but those people were more willing to talk, because suddenly, instead of asking a lawyer for Pfizer saying, how do you justify your position in global patents? I was able to ask somebody in philanthropy, how do you balance your efforts to make your drugs accessible, because they have programs for the poor to do that, with the patent issues. And they were very willing to speak on that. So I think you have to find the right entry, into the system. And then when actually speaking to them, you're asking about what I only have my own experience. I mean, when I finally got an interview, I was so grateful. I was just not thinking of anything, but, oh, this is so good that I can finally talk to someone. I mean, what I found was they were very sophisticated, and they had probably heard every critique that you can think of already, and they have a comeback for everything, So it can be like, I found, the first person I got to talk to was a medical anthropologist. So when you are able to encounter that powerful other, they might be quite different from what you think they are. I think it's also, it's important to credit them as, compassionate human beings. Don't kind of go out with the angle, you're evil, tell me why you're evil. I think it's best to say, ask them what they do, what you think that what does their work contribute? How do they balance? Ask a question of balance. How do they balance their policies? I don't know, maybe you're thinking of the people involved in the development project in Vietnam. How do they develop, CPM is in favor of the development project. How do they balance the interest of public interest with development, which many people say is necessary for the state of Kerala? You can also refer to many people think, to sort of show that maybe it's not your opinion, but that that many people support their opinion. I think you have to get them into a place where they feel like you're not in attack mode, is a key thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like the later part of what you said, I had a small, very positive experiences. We were working on treatment of persons with pedophilia, and self-identified, non-offending and motivated persons with pedophilia should approach to us.
Oh, wow.
And we'll give them anonymous, confidential, free of charge treatment for indefinite period. That was the project.
Right.
And I was the one, I was supposed to answer them. I said, I'm not going to accept your grant, and that went on for 6 months. Because I said, after 6 months, if you ask me, show the patients. The patients are not likely to volunteer and come forward.
Yeah.
And their corporate social involvement, they did not call it corporate social responsibility.
Okay, yes.
They kept very close monitoring of what we did. Our institute, we accepted the grant and we did the study.
Okay.
They were very positive. And I think positive people also are there willing to accept, and like you said, we have to find the right entry.
Yeah.
And not to ask them, tell me why you are ready.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And they do, yeah, no.
We were very small fish for
Yes, exactly. And they do support research and interventions that don't involve their own products.
Exactly.
You know,
That is what
right.
the situation here was. It was not
Yeah.
related to any of their molecules.
And I think, you know, we can,
Agreed to any trial or anything.
and we could look at that in two ways. We could look at that cynically, oh, like that's good PR. If their corporate philanthropy was only based on their own products, everyone would be cynical. If they go beyond that, the public has a better view of them. But maybe it's also genuine. Maybe there are people in the company who have a genuine interest in spending some of the money. So, you know, it's difficult to assess the motivation and good and bad, but the situation is complex as one thing that we can conclude. Anyway, let's move on to, for the sake of time, Ida Susser speaking about her work in Puerto Rico more directly. Mm-hmm.
I should not speak as many questions.
Sorry?
Taking too much time.
Oh no, that's actually these are, you have experiences that are very valuable to all of this, you know, to these topics. So one more thing, in critical medical anthropologists, they often trace their genealogy back to Rudolf Virchow, who I've put the, whatever it is, the Google entry up here. Virchow was a physician who worked for the, whatever it was called, the king, the chancellor of Prussia in the 1800s. He's known in the world of medicine for his work in like cell pathology, but he's also considered a pioneer in medical anthropology because he was asked by the whatever you call the head guy of Prussia at the time, to investigate an outbreak of, actually let me just go to my notes because I'm not on the right page here, to investigate an outbreak of typhus in the Upper Silesia, this part of Prussia in the 1840s, and he reported that the cause was poverty and poor infrastructure provided by the government. You know, he didn't just locate the illness in people's bodies and suggest what treatment we can do to the bodies. He suggested the sanitation and the fact that it was a poor neighborhood, therefore getting not as good sanitation, and the lack of government interest in providing the sanitation in the poor neighborhood was the ultimate cause. And he got some, you know, sort of unhappy, grumbling response from his higher-ups in the Prussian government. But anyway, that's sort of, you know, an origin story. A person, there's still something called the Virchow Award that the Critical Medical Anthropology group gives to, I think it's a student paper every year to an undergraduate and to postgraduate students. They can be, you know, submit a paper they've done for the Virchow Award. In addition to Ida Susser, another important figure in critical medical anthropology is Merrill Singer, who died recently. Oh wait, no, sorry, he hasn't died. I've killed him off before his time. I thought I must be confusing him with someone else. He just has a birthday, unless Wikipedia, or maybe it's that was in critical condition or something like that. There's just some of his books. Critical Medical Anthropology, 1995, and more recently he's worked on the anthropology of climate change and where health is one of the main perspectives. And he developed this concept of syndemics, which is sort of how different illnesses and social factors go together to create a sort of a cumulative effect. That's a phrase he's associated with. Go back to Merrill Singer. Introduction to Syndemics, just another book I will mention briefly. And it's a approach that tries to integrate medical anthropology and public health, go beyond into multiple disciplines. And Paul Farmer is another one. He's in the film this afternoon, and I'll just sort of skip him for now, for the sake of time. So Ida Susser's article takes place in Puerto Rico. Is anybody familiar with Puerto Rico? I'm thinking this might be a place in the world that some of you may not know. Is this a familiar location? You know anything about Puerto Rico? Or what part of the world this is? Latin America? Yeah, basically, or some people might say the Caribbean more precisely, but part of the Caribbean is also Latin America. So let's just go there on Google Maps. This is actually something I like to do when we have ethnography from different parts of the world. I didn't go to southeastern Tanzania last time, but I should have. So let's just go to Puerto Rico. Caribbean, yeah, exactly. So here we are, this sort of rectangular island right here, next to the Dominican Republic, and we go zoom out a bit. We see where we are in the world. So now we also have Haiti over here, where Paul Farmer, important critical medical anthropologist, has worked in Cuba. And you can just see the US, Florida, sticking out there. Oops, wrong way. So there's the US up there, South America down here, Venezuela, and so Puerto Rico right there. And Puerto Rico also, she doesn't say this in the article, maybe she's assuming that her readers will know this, but it's part of the US. I mean, somewhat ambiguously, it has this Commonwealth relationship to the US. So the people of Puerto Rico are citizens of the US. They use the US dollar in Puerto Rico. And they're allowed to vote in elections, but Puerto Rico has no representative in the Congress, in the legislature of the US. So there's debates about Puerto Rico. There's an independence movement that wants to be separate from the US. There's a political movement that it's pro-statehood. They want to become a US state. And then there's the party that wants to maintain the ambiguous relationship with the US. And it was a source of labor and production in the slave-based economy that was widespread throughout the Americas, that focused mostly on sugar and tobacco were the main products, and actually most of the Caribbean. Sugar and tobacco produced by European plantation owners with slave labor was the economy of this part of the world for a couple hundred years until the end of slavery. And then Puerto Rico becomes a source of sort of offshore corporate development for mostly US companies, and Union Carbide was one of the corporations that also operated in India, as you know, in many places around the world. And she says, at the beginning of the article, I suppose it was very obvious when she explains that, there is an interest in anthropology in sort of folk terminologies and explanations, an interest in humoral medicine, an interest in, she says on the first page, espiritistas and curanderos, who combine beliefs derived from African spiritual systems, Catholicism, and humoral medicine. She's making a critical point, very politely. Anthropologists have been interested in this cultural stuff, the exotic aspects of cultural difference. She mentions espiritistas and curanderos. Those are terms for like traditional healers in Puerto Rico and Hispanic Caribbean cultures. But then she says, such approaches overlook, as the top of page 562. At the same time, These approaches underestimate the impact of modern work experiences, income, political power, and class relations on social perceptions of health and illness. And a little further down that same page, medical events must be placed in political and economic context at a specific point in time if their social import is to be grasped. The appearance of an individual in a doctor's office with gastrointestinal complaint cannot be separated from questions regarding adequate sanitation facilities in his home and the responsibilities of institutions to provide such facilities. And over on page 563, she explains how, discussions of health in the context in which she worked were done in terms of Western categories, in terms of Western medical categories. And so, people like the villagers in Puerto Rico she worked with, yes, they may also, visit curanderos and traditional healers, but they were very capable of talking about disease that can come from industrial pollution using Western or allopathic categories. She's trying to de-exoticize, and politicize the perspective, And now that looks very obvious, but in 1985 when she was writing, when, culture was the thing everyone was looking at, she and a few others were saying, yeah, you can look at these quaint beliefs, but you're overlooking the fact that most of these people are also in the modern world, in systems of capitalist production and wage labor, and we have to ask what that situation brings to the table. Let me ask you, what are some of your perspectives on what she says about what happens in Puerto Rico in this community in Yabucoa? What are some of the issues that people are concerned about with Union Carbide, the factory, and their health? And what do they do about it?
In the name of economy and money,
Mm-hmm.
like most of this politically, we are doing most important things under the corporate. For example, health. That is all in the name of money and economy. It was with the political support, the health, the citizen health, massively it was under the corporate leg. It was hidden. For example, she was talking about the pollution in the place of pollution. Sanitation was talked about, but the pollution
yes.
should be first care about it.
Right.
Then the sanitation should follow them. So it's always like there is a political economy which built in this thing. So because of this, they are the least bothered. They were the marginalized communities. They were least bothered in this thing.
They were the marginalized communities, and they were the least.
Like they are economically, they are in a position to depend on these changes, shifting over from the plantation to this cotton dust and all. But
Right.
still, they couldn't do anything because their economics lies on this thing.
Right. Yeah, well, yeah, and they actually, one thing that's important is that they like the jobs because they provide good income.
Yes.
But as she says, that doesn't mean they're willing to accept any health risk, with that job, right?
I think one of the factors that influenced that decision, even though they knew that they needed the jobs
Yeah.
for survival, they couldn't really turn a blind eye to the bad effects, like the consequences of it, because they said they were concerned about the health of their children.
Right.
So that is a motivating factor, that because they when they saw their child being affected by the pollution and the doctors asked them to move out of the place, that's when, that was one factor that even though they might not have been really concerned about their own health, but they were more concerned about their children and the future generation and how that is affecting them.
Right.
So that's why they were very adamant on the protest, or like continuing with the protest.
Okay, right, exactly. And there's the protest, right? There's a attempt to resist. There's agency, there's resistance, in this.
It says that the protest it started with very youth members, and it was not the prominent people who came up, it was the youth who came up, and people who are not very much educated, like it was not the prominent members of the society, it was the underdogs who were getting there.
Right. Okay, yeah, okay, yeah, no, okay, good, yeah, thank you for
But
that.
this entity itself cannot be considered as homogeneous also because there were reassurances given by the Union Carbide and some of them were in favor of getting or retaining the jobs there.
Yeah,
So there were divisions within the protest group itself. And another thing that I found interesting was she doesn't conclude the fact that this corporate or Union Carbide is responsible for all the problems.
yeah.
She outlines the different aspects that could have contributed to this, and she keeps it open-ended and like for a policy research kind of domain towards the end.
That's true, and she acknowledges that there are other health issues, but she also shows how those other problems can be politicized in relationship. But I think you're bringing up an important point, that this community is not, uniform in its voice. Yeah, and she has this one person, what was it, Roberto Rodriguez or something? Yeah, Roberto Gonzalez, yeah, this who is kind of working against the people protesting your Union Carbide, and you mentioned sanitation being the other problem. What about sanitation? How is that coming into play, or how are these different problems, sanitation and industrial pollution, politicized?
I think they're trying to shift the attention from the pollution into sanitation. They mentioned the reasons for that, so that because the pollution comes under, if it's pollution, it's the responsibility of the corporate.
Right.
If it's sanitation, it is the municipality's responsibility. So it is putting the municipality at fault. And also there is something else that they mentioned, some of the reasons that sanitation.
Oh, yeah.
It was overflowing into the streets.
Right.
Because heavy rains.
Right, the septic tanks weren't being emptied, yeah, exactly.
They didn't have the money to actually clean it, so they just didn't clean it at all. And because of the rains, it was overflowing into the streets and it was creating an
And what's the onus of the responsibility on the people?
municipality.
Exactly, right, yeah, the responsibility is the people themselves, their own, right, their own neglect, can be the source of blame. And you also mentioned the responsibility of the local municipality. And then she also explains later on that this, like on page 578, it was, the Roberto Gonzalez was planning on running for mayor, and the town is governed by the opposition party, who would be responsible for sanitation. So, it's sanitation as a cause of illness becomes a political claim, which gets Union Carbide off the hook and puts the onus on and
unemployment that they mentioned.
yes, right.
The unemployed. And Roberto is mentioning that if at the cost of having to get through the dire consequences of pollution, people are getting the jobs. So that is they have to weigh.
Exactly.
Choose one.
Right, and people resisting Union Carbide through a lawsuit, some of them were willing to leave the suit because they wanted to get jobs, and there was, of course, people losing jobs. So you see many dynamics going on around here, how all the levers of power are being used at the same time from different sides. Yeah, and Roberto Gonzalez's people, they say it's sanitation is a problem. They say the other problem is employment. Okay, so they're willing to accept some of the problems because of the employment opportunities. I think this is really a nicely done portrait of how these kind of problems play out in a small community. You see lots of different interests involved at the level of the people who live there, the local politics. You see the corporate actors, all coming into one place. I think it's a very good early example of critical medical anthropology. Ida Susser herself, she's my colleague at the CUNY Graduate Center. I've actually known her for a long time. It's interesting. I went, I did my PhD at the CUNY City University of New York Graduate Center, the PhD program there. And then after finishing, I was hired in the same system, the City University of New York, but at one of the undergraduate colleges at Queens College. But then after several years, I was also appointed to the Graduate Center program, for the PhD program. So people at the colleges can basically sort of apply to also be at the Graduate Center. So now she was like my teacher before, and now she's my colleague, at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's, and she went on to do lots of other work. In fact, this is just, one of her earliest pieces, and I still think one of the best. And later on, she worked on AIDS in South Africa, and she has a book on that. And sort of looking at gender roles and how that related to how the AIDS crisis was managed in South Africa. She's worked on problems in the urban U.S. Among the poor, not always medical. She's also works in other non-medical topics. So turning to Foucault, okay. We have a very different perspective on power. I mean, power, I think, is clear to everyone at the various levels, at the local level, at the corporate level, in the situation in Puerto Rico. Foucault comes at power from a different angle. And actually, let me put on this.
So,
Yeah.
this particular slide that was done, what is the current status there?
Oh, in this place in Puerto Rico, I don't know. Actually, I was asking myself the question when I was rereading this, thinking I have no idea what's happening now in Yabucoa, Puerto Rico. I know in the larger context of Puerto Rico, it's still a place for corporate outsourcing, but mostly for pharmaceutical companies. So there's a lot of pharmaceutical company production now in Puerto Rico, because they get like a tax relief. They don't have to pay local taxes, whereas if they stayed in the U.S. and the U.S. state, they would. So but then they've also had a major financial crisis in the last few years. They were also hit hard by several hurricanes in the Caribbean, which destroyed the power grid. They were without power for months. A third of the population lives in the U.S., and now I think it's almost half after the hurricane. They have a lot of problems, and then the U.S. government has taken over. They've created this committee that manages the economy for Puerto Rico, and so they sort of taken over from the local people the management of it's an ugly mess in many ways right now. Same issues are at play as were in these, but with different companies. Foucault, what do you do with Foucault? Just talking about him briefly. I'll see if I can try to explain this reading I've assigned you by explaining how it fits in the larger picture of his work. So the chapter I gave you is from this book, Madness and Civilization. Chapter 9, it's the last chapter before the conclusion. It's sort of where the book ends. And it's probably good to know a little bit about where the book starts. It's a history of, again, madness is Foucault is French. It's written in French. So madness is the English word. It's interesting to note the French word was la folie, F-O-L-I-E, which is like the English word folly, which has a different meaning from madness. It can also be kind of light and silly. And in a way, it's good to remember that, because that's kind of what Foucault is not telling a history of mental illness. That's where it ended up in the end of the story in this chapter. He's trying to use this more overarching term, so he chooses folly, this, or unreason. What is the history of how we, but he's writing from France. He means, he's looking at Europeans, how we have engaged with folly, madness over time. And the book starts in the Middle Ages in Europe, and a discussion of the ship of fools. There was this belief that I forget now because I haven't read the first part of the book in some time, but there's a whole belief about madness and water and movement, and the idea was that they put the mad on these ships that would ply the rivers of Europe, just kind of move around. And then later on, madness became something that was sort of criminalized. Maybe criminalized isn't the right word, but people who were mad were incarcerated along with criminals. It was not a part of the medical realm. We tend to think now with our current understanding of madness as mental illness to just project into the past that that's sort of always what it's been, but it has fallen into different categories. It's only with, as the chapter is called, the birth of the asylum, two particular asylums that he discusses here, one by Tuke in the UK, England, Northern England, and one, run by Mr. Pinel two asylums in France. And the asylums take the madman out of prison, it takes the chains off and puts them in a different category, a different kind of space. And at the very end of the chapter, you have the arrival of the medical person to this scene. And the story ends with our current way of seeing things, that it's a medical problem. And so he's showing you one thing is that there's different ways that this, I don't want to say problem, I've been using that term, but that's, folly, it is what it is, has been engaged, not necessarily solved at earlier points. And he's also trying to tell a story that's different from the usual heroic, or what's the word I'm looking for? Teleological story that people tell about the history of madness, which is a story of triumph, of increasing humanity, that, yay, we freed the madman from the oppression of incarceration into this more humane system. But Foucault is trying to tell a different story. We may still believe that this is a good story, that's fine, but he's also showing us that it's not that suddenly the madman was placed in a system where there was no more power and control and surveillance. It was that the kind of power and control and surveillance was different from the incarceration and the chains that came before that. It's a system of, well, actually, let me make that to a question for you. What is the form of control and power and discipline that becomes enacted upon the mad person in the asylum? I was asking, what is the form of control and power that is exercised upon the mad person in the asylum now that he's quote unquote free of the chains and he's in the humane asylum?
Which is more observational and has a lot of moral undertones to the old form, the new form.
You mean panopticon, something like that?
Sorry?
Panopticon system?
The panopticon is from other work by Foucault, but the idea there of observation is there too. That's important. Sorry?
So I was saying, the idea of surveillance that Foucault also mentions, like the madmen were always observed by the keeper.
Right.
And they did not do actively anything to restrain their behaviors, but a sense of guilt was organized and always inculcated in them so that they regulate their own behaviors.
That's right. They regulate their own, they become their own sort of authority, their own sort of repressor at the same time, as it were. And this is normally just looked at as liberation, but he's showing you how it's, the result of liberation movements, Foucault would say, is not, freedom from power. It's the result is a new constellation of power. And there's always some discomfort I have with some of the ways he explains this, To give a couple quotes, these two things I've highlighted with a yellow highlighter. Um, Again, this is from page 261 of Foucault's The Birth of the Asylum. He says, henceforth more genuinely confined than he could have been in a dungeon and chains, a prisoner of nothing but himself, the sufferer was caught in a relation to himself that was of the order of transgression, and in a non-relation to others that was of the order of shame. Or further below, delivered from his chains, he is now chained by silence to transgression and to shame. He feels himself punished, and he sees the sign of his innocence in that fact. Free from all physical punishment, he must prove himself guilty. His torment was his glory. His deliverance must humiliate him. So, and he also explains elsewhere that there was a certain freedom and madness, that that there was this oppressive other out there oppressing you. You have to learn in the asylum to be your own monitor, and you're now responsible for everything. You internalize all the shame. When reading this, I always say to myself, but surely Foucault must think it was somehow better to be out of the chains. that really the new system can't be completely as oppressive, but I think the way to understand his thinking is that he probably would say, he probably would not deny that. He would probably, in a different context, be supportive of the removal of chains. But he wants to say, it's not like now we have freedom. He wants to acknowledge that one form of power is replaced by another form of power rather than freedom. So I think that that's how I reconcile the the apparent intellectualization of this difference.
I think to me it looks like how you inculcate a moral compass within an individual, and then you don't need the surveillance by somebody else anymore.
Right, yeah.
I become my own. But then this process of forming this moral compass will inevitably be shaped by the norms.
Yeah.
So then, that's where this becomes a problem, I think, because, for example, we have this term called social moral policing. So if something is considered not normal by the social arrangement, then that becomes a problem. So that's where this becomes an ethical, whether this sort of moral compass is the real solution, becomes to me.
Okay, right, and a very central part of Foucault's theory of power in general, or what he calls modern power, the place we are at now, is that we all become self-monitors. This is just one example of this. He shows, like you mentioned, the panopticon. He shows how punishment has changed, from the sort of physical, grotesque public punishment of the body to putting people in prison. Again, we might say, we became more civilized. Sure, but let's examine this new form of power. It's not freedom, it's still power, and how does it work? And it's a system of surveillance where, as he points out, one doesn't always know. He discusses the panopticon, a certain kind of prison where you're watched because of the architecture, you're always watched, but you don't know if you're being watched. And you just learn to internalize being watched and become the self-watcher. Yeah.
On the one hand, it is like internalizing the societal norms and values, and that is the process of civilization, also from the psychotic patient, he becomes neurotic.
Right.
He internalizes the controls and then surveils himself.
Right.
There is an interesting article in Culture, Medicine and Psychiatry, 24-25, by Reed, R-E-E-D, R-E-E-D.
Okay.
They will surveil you to death.
They will surveil you to death.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, right.
Gang stalking as a new cultural concept of distress.
Right, okay.
Gang stalking. So they would naturally be classified as paranoid schizophrenics, but not necessarily and not always so.
Okay.
Or social media and various other things, they gather the evidence that people are surveilling me. And that is how they go on reducing their circle of freedom.
Okay. They reduce their own circle of freedom. Okay.
They are neatly mapped onto conventional psychiatric diagnostic categories.
Okay. There's and that was from Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry. You said, yeah, that which is a good journal to know about. That's an important journal in medical anthropology that also has contributions from other fields, culture, medicine, and psychiatry. Let me give. I know we should take our break soon. Let me show you an image that I use in. Wait, no, this must be. That's not my. Need to go to my drives images. Pictures. I have a picture of a quote from Foucault. There it is. So this is actually from inside the building, in the lobby of the building where my office is at Queens College. They filled the building with quotations from different thinkers. And this holds one of the most prominent places. And when I teach my social theory classes, I always have my students, we walk to the lobby and we stand by the quote and I have them interpret this. And I think it really is an excellent, this is from a different book by Foucault, not the one you've read this chapter from. So thought is no longer theoretical. As soon as it functions, it offends or reconciles, attracts or repels, breaks, associates, dissociates, unites or reunites. It cannot help but liberate and enslave. In other words, there's sort of, in a way, there's no neutral space, and that these ideas and practices can have conflicting results. They cannot help but liberate and enslave. Again, the idea, the result of liberation is not freedom, it's a new constellation of power. There's also a famous quote you can find, a famous debate you can find on YouTube from the 1980s between Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky. I don't know if you guys know Noam Chomsky, a US sort of critic of everything who actually has a larger international audience than he has in the US. Foucault and Chomsky had a debate on Dutch television, a television station in the Netherlands, because that's the kind of place that would hold that debate. They would never have that on TV in the US. About power, about these issues. Chomsky is this very much person who's like, the power system is clear, there's oppressors and repressors, and we know where power is located, and he's kind of like the position we see in Ida Sesser. And then Foucault, in his, gives you his own perspective, which is much more complicated. Anyway, I recommend it. You can just look up Foucault-Chomsky debate. You can even add Dutch television, maybe that'll, if it doesn't come out right away. So it's 11, so we should be taking our our tea break, and then we'll come back and resume after that. Maybe we'll go straight to the film from there. Mm-hmm. Sorry?
After the discussion, do you agree with Chomsky or Foucault?
Who won the debate? Who did? Oh, I don't know. I think both perspectives are important. I think that power, the forces in the world that Chomsky points out, are real and important and have real effects on us. But it's not only those things that restrict us. Mm-hmm.
This one, I didn't understand. Here he says it cannot help but liberate and enslave.
Yeah.
Why couldn't he say liberate or enslave? Why liberate and enslave?
Well, I actually think and is better than or. I think when I reread this, I think he probably should have used and every time. That as soon as thought functions, it attracts and repels. Because I think it always does both.
But it sounds like an oxymoron. Like liberation and enslavement in the
Well, just like, you know, the new way of treating the mad person is both liberation and enslavement. It's not just liberation, yeah. I mean, one could argue that it's more liberation than there was before, you know, but both things are there. Like, and every time you come up with this new idea, the new paradigm that's supposed to improve things, that paradigm also has new restrictions. I mean, maybe enslavement isn't too dramatic a word, you know, in this kind.
By unchaining is liberation, liberating the new humiliation.
Yeah. Yeah, right, exactly, yeah. And removing the chains, he's moved on to another form of, right, of restriction.